She built an empire from nothing, and then, one night, a single impact on wet asphalt took everything that mattered. Not the company, not the money, not the title on the door. It took the one thing she never knew she needed until it was gone, the belief that she was still worth something. Victoria Sterling sat in a boardroom full of people afraid to look at her wheelchair, and she couldn't blame them. She couldn't look at it either. Then a mechanic with grease on his hands and zero interest in her net worth said 4 words nobody else had bothered to say. I can fix this. Button. If this story hits different, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this one travels. The wheelchair arrived on a Tuesday. Not the accident. That had happened 11 months earlier, on a rain-soaked Thursday in November, when a delivery truck ran a red light on Meridian Avenue and hit the passenger side of Victoria's car hard enough to spin it 2 full rotations before it came to rest against a fire hydrant. No. The accident had been a Thursday, but the wheelchair, the one she actually used now, the one that had replaced the temporary hospital model, and the second one she'd sent back after 3 days because the armrests were wrong, that one arrived on a Tuesday, and Victoria had stared at the delivery confirmation on her phone for 11 minutes before she let her assistant bring it in. The chair was good, titanium frame, custom measured, lightweight. Her physical therapist, a no-nonsense woman named Dr. Patricia Owens, had practically glowed describing it. This is the one, Patricia had said. This is going to change things for you. Victoria had nodded the way she'd learned to nod, with her chin slightly down, her expression neutral, just enough warmth to end the conversation. She hadn't painted since the Thursday. That was the part nobody really understood, or maybe the part they understood too well to mention. The spinal injury at T10 had left her with full function of her arms, her hands, everything from the waist up. Physically, she could paint. Her hands worked fine. Her right hand still moved with the same precision it always had. There was no medical reason she couldn't stand in front of a canvas and do the things she'd been doing since she was 9 years old. But she hadn't. She'd told herself 100 different stories about why. She was busy. She was focused on recovery. The company needed her. Sterling Tech had 63 employees and 3 active contracts with municipal government clients, and a 4th under negotiation. And none of those 63 people could afford for their CEO to be sitting in a studio somewhere getting paint on her fingers while quarterly reports went unsigned. That was a reasonable story. She'd told it to herself so many times that it had started to feel like the truth. It wasn't the truth. The truth was simpler and uglier. The truth was that painting had always been the one place she felt completely unguarded, and being unguarded now felt like standing in traffic. Her office was on the 14th floor of the Aldridge Building in downtown Crestwood, a mid-sized city in the Pacific Northwest that had the particular quality of being just large enough to have ambition and just small enough that everybody knew your story. Victoria had moved here at 24 to launch Sterling Tech with $60,000, a rented desk and a co-working space, and a genuinely unreasonable amount of confidence. By 27, she'd signed her first government contract. By 29, she'd been featured in 2 regional business publications and invited to speak at a conference she'd been too busy to attend. At 30, she'd gotten into a car on a rainy Thursday evening and the world had rearranged itself around her. The 14th floor was fully accessible now. The renovations had been done while she was still in the hospital. She'd approved them by video call from a bed that smelled like antiseptic and other people's misery, going through the architectural drawings with her facilities manager, while a physical therapist waited in the corner of the room to put her through another round of exercises she hated. The office itself had wide corridors, a lowered reception desk, a bathroom with proper clearances. Everything was exactly right. It still felt like somebody else's space. She rolled through it every morning. That was the word she'd settled on. Rolled because it was accurate and neutral and didn't carry the weight that other words did. And she did the job. And she did it well enough that the quarterly numbers were strong, and the municipal contract had been renewed, and 3 of her department heads had received industry recognition that reflected, by extension, on Sterling Tech. The company was fine. Victoria was less fine. The wheelchair issue started the way most problems started, gradually and then all at once. The right rear wheel had been developing a slight wobble for about 3 weeks. She'd noticed it first on the hardwood floor of her apartment, a faint rhythmic irregularity in the way the chair tracked when she was moving quickly. She'd mentioned it to Patricia, who'd suggested contacting the manufacturer. The manufacturer had a 3 to 4 week service window and a process that involved shipping the chair out for evaluation, which meant she'd need to use a loaner during that time. Victoria had ended that call in under 90 seconds. Her building's maintenance guy, a round-faced man named Gerald, who'd been quietly helpful without being intrusive since her return to the office, had recommended a physical therapist friend who knew wheelchair mechanics. That friend hadn't been available. Gerald had then, with the careful awkwardness of someone trying to help without overstepping, mentioned a shop he'd heard about. "It's just a garage, really," Gerald said, visibly uncertain whether he was helping or insulting her. "But the guy, Walker, I think, apparently he does good work. My neighbor's kid uses a chair and she says he's the best she's found. Does custom stuff. Modifications." "Is he a certified technician?" Gerald's face did something complicated. "I'm not totally sure about that." Victoria looked at him for a moment. The wobble had gotten slightly worse in the past week, a sensation that was now consistently present when she was on anything but carpet. The idea of spending 4 weeks in a loaner chair she hadn't been measured for was genuinely unpleasant. "What's the address?" she said. Walker's garage sat at the far end of Clement Street, in a part of Crestwood that the real estate listings described as up and coming, and that actually meant a block of auto shops, a laundromat that appeared to have been operating continuously since 1987, a taqueria with handwritten menus and outstanding carnitas, and an irregular scattering of small businesses that seemed to survive on stubbornness and local loyalty. The garage itself was not impressive. It occupied a converted residential property, the front yard long since given over to a concrete pad, and a metal ramp that ran up to a wide rolling door. A hand-painted sign above the door read, "Walkers, Repairs and Modifications," the lettering competent but not professional, the kind of sign a person made themselves because they were capable and frugal rather than because they couldn't afford better. The rolling door was open. Inside, she could see shelving units running floor to ceiling, a workbench with organized tools, and the back half of something she couldn't identify. A portable speaker near the workbench was playing, at moderate volume, what sounded like a 1970s soul record. Victoria sat in her car, the modified one, with the hand controls, which she was still learning to feel fully comfortable in, and looked at the garage for a moment. Behind her, in the rearview mirror, she could see the downtown skyline where her office sat on the 14th floor of the Aldridge building. She looked at it, and then she looked at the hand-painted sign. She got out of the car. The concrete approach had a slight grade to it, enough that she felt it in her arms. The ramp to the garage door was better. Someone had built it right. Proper slope, non-slip surface, edges that weren't going to catch a caster wheel. She noticed that without meaning to. She noticed a lot of things about surfaces now that she never would have registered before. "Hello?" The speaker paused. A head emerged from under the workbench, or rather, from beside a piece of equipment she could now identify as a power wheelchair base in some stage of disassembly. The head belonged to a man in his early 30s, dark-haired, with the kind of jaw that needed shaving twice a day and hadn't been today. He was wearing a gray t-shirt with a hole near the left shoulder and work pants that had seen significant use. There was a smear of grease on his right forearm and a pencil tucked behind his ear. He looked at her with no particular reaction. Not the careful neutrality that some people performed when they saw the wheelchair and were trying not to seem like it was a thing. Not the excessive warmth that others overcorrected into. Just a look. Like she was a customer who'd come in. "You the Sterling?" he said. "Victoria Sterling." "Yes." He stood up. He was taller than she'd expected from seeing just the top of his head. Maybe 6 feet, solidly built. Not gym built, but work built. The kind of body that came from actual physical use, rather than a fitness regimen. He wiped his hands on a rag that was already not clean. "Gerald called ahead," he said, as if that explained everything. "You've got a wobble in the rear, right? Correct?" He tilted his head slightly, looking at the chair in the way she'd seen mechanics look at cars. A brief visual assessment that was somehow also a comprehensive one. "Can I take a look?" "That's why I'm here." She could tell he registered the edge in her tone, and she could tell it didn't particularly bother him. He gestured toward the open space beside the workbench. "Come on in. Watch the extension cord on the left. It's not in the best spot. I keep meaning to move it." "I've already seen it," she said. He glanced at the floor, then back at her. Yeah, I figured. His name was Ethan Walker, and he'd been running the garage for 4 years. She learned this not from him volunteering information, but from asking direct questions while he examined the wheelchair. Because when he worked, he went quiet in a focused way that felt less like rudeness and more like he was actually doing the thing he was supposed to be doing instead of performing the task while talking. She found this both irritating and unexpectedly easy to be around. The wobble was in the bearing housing, he said, crouching beside the rear wheel with a small flashlight. There was also some wear on the caster fork that he wanted to check. He asked her about daily use, distances, surfaces, how much time on tile versus carpet versus outdoor concrete. He asked about the chair's age and whether she'd noticed any change in how it handled turns. He asked these questions the way someone asked them when the answers actually affected their work. "How long have you been doing this?" Victoria said. "Wheelchair repair specifically." "About 3 years. Started doing my neighbor's chair. She couldn't get decent service anywhere close, kept having to drive 40 minutes to the city, did enough of those that it made sense to learn properly." He paused. "I'm certified. Before you ask." Gerald wasn't sure. Gerald's a good guy, but he loses track of details. Ethan set down the flashlight. "The bearing needs to be replaced. I can do the caster fork same day if you want. It's not urgent, but it'll become urgent in about 6 weeks." He named a price. It was significantly lower than what the manufacturer had quoted. "Are you using manufacturer parts?" "Well, they're the best option. For the bearing housing, I use an aftermarket supplier, but better quality, honestly, and I'll show you the specs if you want. I don't do anything I can't explain." Victoria considered this. "Fine. How long?" "Couple hours for today's work. I'd want to see it again in about 2 weeks. Make sure everything's settling right." She looked around the garage. There were, she now noticed, photographs pinned to a corkboard above the workbench. Most of them showed wheelchairs in various states of modification, colored frames, custom attachments, a hand cycle conversion that looked like real engineering work. A few showed people using them, though the photos were positioned so the faces weren't immediately visible, which she thought was deliberate. "Sit or wait?" Ethan said. "What? Do you want to sit here while I work, or would you rather wait somewhere else?" "There's a chair." He stopped, apparently registering his word choice. "A stool near the door, or the taqueria 2 blocks down isn't bad." "I'll stay," Victoria said. He nodded once, like that was entirely fine, and went back to work. Well, she wasn't sure afterward how the conversation started. He worked in that focused silence for about 40 minutes, occasionally asking her a technical question about what the wobble had felt like, at what speeds, whether it was present uphill. She answered. At some point, he put the soul record back on, and she recognized it as something she couldn't name but had heard before. A slow track with a horn section that moved through the garage like something physical. "What's this?" she said. "Al Green. Tired of being alone." He glanced up briefly. "You know it." "I know him. Don't know this one specifically." Ethan said nothing to that, which was fine, and then he said, "Gerald mentioned you run Sterling Tech." "Yes." "Tech company?" "Software infrastructure, municipal contracts mostly, transit systems, public works management platforms. Not exactly exciting." "Sounds complicated." "It is. That part I don't mind." He looked at her for a second longer than felt casual. "What part do you mind?" Victoria wasn't sure why she answered. She was not a person who talked to strangers about the parts she minded. She had a therapist, court-mandated after the accident, technically, though she'd kept going after the requirement ended because she'd decided it was useful. And she had one genuine friend, a woman named Diane, who'd known her since college and who had the specific quality of being able to handle the truth. Those were the people she was honest with, not mechanics in garages on Clement Street. "The performance of it," she said. "Everyone watching to see if I'm going to be okay." Ethan turned back to the wheel housing. "Are you?" "I'm CEO of a company with 63 employees and a $14 million annual revenue. I'm clearly functional." "That's not what I asked." She didn't answer that one. He didn't push. He just worked. And the Al Green record moved through its second track, and the afternoon light came in through the open garage door at a low angle and made everything look like a photograph. "I used to paint," she said. She didn't know why she said it. It came out the way things came out sometimes. Not as a decision, but as something that had been building pressure and finally found a gap. Ethan kept his hands moving. What kind? Oil, mostly. Some watercolor when I was younger. Oil was what I ended up coming back to. Professional? No, I sold work occasionally. Small gallery shows, a few commissions. Nothing that paid. I didn't need it to pay. She paused. I liked it because it was mine. The company. There are 63 people whose livelihoods depend on the company. Painting was the one thing where there were no stakes. But you stopped. It wasn't a question. He'd either inferred it or Gerald had told him more than she'd realized. After the accident, she said. He nodded slowly. He didn't ask why. He didn't offer the expected response about how she should get back to it, how the accident didn't have to define her, how art was healing. She'd gotten all of those, and she was tired of them. What did you give up? She said. Because it seemed like the right question, and because something in the way he moved through this space, careful, competent, slightly contained, suggested that there was a different version of him somewhere that he didn't talk about. Ethan's hand stopped for a moment. Just a moment. Industrial design, he said. Started a program, didn't finish it. Why not? He set down a tool and picked up another. Had a daughter, her mother and I. It didn't work out. Maya was 2. He said this without particular inflection, the way people said things that had happened a long time ago and that they'd made their peace with, or at least their arrangement with. Design school's expensive and takes time. This was quicker to make work. Do you regret it? Some days. He said it immediately, which surprised her. Most people hedged that kind of admission. Some days I draw in my sketchbook and it feels like watching someone else's life through a window. Other days it just feels like what happened. Victoria looked at the photographs on the corkboard, the modified wheelchairs. You designed those. The modifications? Yeah. That's design work. He glanced at the corkboard. Something in his face shifted. Not quite dismissal, but close to it. It's practical work. Those aren't the same thing, but they're also not mutually exclusive. He looked at her. It was the first time she felt like he was actually looking at her, rather than at a customer he was being helpful with. You sound like someone who thinks hard about this stuff, he said. I used to have a lot of time to think, less now. Because of the company. Because of the recovery. She said it flat. Physical therapy and medical appointments have a way of filling a calendar. Yeah, he said quietly. I imagine. But he finished the first round of repairs just after 4 in the afternoon. He rolled the chair back to her, carefully, she noticed, not carelessly, and walked her through what he'd done, showing her the replaced bearing and explaining the tolerances. He had a way of explaining technical things that didn't condescend and didn't over-explain, and she appreciated that more than she expected to. Try it, he said. She transferred back. The right rear wheel tracked perfectly, no wobble, and when she took a few strokes toward the garage door, the difference was immediately perceptible. The chair moved the way it was supposed to move, evenly and without resistance. Good, she said. Come back in 2 weeks. I want to make sure the housing is seated correctly under normal use. She stopped near the door. Outside, Clement Street was doing its late afternoon thing. A few people heading into the taqueria. A car idling in front of the laundromat. The particular quality of light that happened in this part of the Pacific Northwest in autumn when the sun came in low and warm for exactly an hour before disappearing entirely. You said you do custom modifications, she said. That's half the business, yeah. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the photographs on the corkboard. The hand cycle. A chair with a custom side tray at exactly the right height. A frame in a deep blue that was so precisely the right blue she almost said something about it before she stopped herself. I have a canvas bag, she said, for painting supplies. I used to carry it on a shoulder strap, but with the chair there's no good way to... It gets in the way of my right wheel if I hang it on the side. I tried attaching it to the back, but then I can't reach it. Ethan said nothing, but she could see him listening in the way he listened when something was going into his working brain. Is that something you could look at? He tilted his head. What are the dimensions of the bag? About 14 inches wide, 9 high. Canvas. The paints themselves are in a separate case, about... She measured with her hands. This. Bring them both when you come back in 2 weeks, he said. I'll see what I can do.
Victoria nodded. She went to pull away and then paused, not sure why. "The music," she said. Ethan looked at the speaker. "Good choice," she said. He almost smiled. It was brief and slightly lopsided and not particularly polished, and it was the first genuinely unguarded expression she'd seen on anyone's face in what felt like longer than she could calculate. "Come back in 2 weeks," he said. She thought about the garage on the drive home. She thought about it the way she sometimes thought about paintings, not deliberately, but in the way a thing lodged in her peripheral vision and didn't leave. The organized chaos of the shelves, the photographs on the corkboard, the way Ethan Walker had asked her if she was okay and meant it as an actual question rather than a greeting. She thought about what she'd said. "I used to paint," past tense. The way she'd said it as if painting were something that had happened to a previous version of her, someone younger and less complicated. Someone who hadn't yet discovered that the world had the capacity to rearrange itself without asking permission. Her apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building on Orchard Street that she'd chosen before the accident for its light and its pre-war ceiling height and its close proximity to the Aldridge building, and that she'd come back to after 2 months of rehabilitation with the sudden acute awareness that the doorways were narrower than they appeared on the floor plan and the bathroom was a careful negotiation every single morning. She'd adapted. She was good at adapting. Adaptation was a core competency. She made herself dinner, real dinner, not takeout, because Patricia had spent 20 minutes last week on the relationship between self-care and recovery outcomes, and Victoria had paid attention even while appearing not to. While the pasta cooked, she stood, sat, at the kitchen window and looked at the city doing its evening thing. In the second bedroom, the one she used as an office, there was a closet. Inside the closet was a canvas bag, and inside the canvas bag were tubes of paint, dried and probably beyond use now, and brushes that needed reconditioning, and a palette she hadn't cleaned properly the last time she'd used it because she'd been running late for something and had planned to clean it when she got back. She hadn't gone back. She didn't open the closet. She went to bed at 10:30 and lay in the dark for a while thinking about a photograph of a wheelchair with a frame painted the exact right shade of blue. The 2 weeks felt longer than 2 weeks. Not because they were empty, they were genuinely full, with back-to-back meetings about the new contract negotiation and a departmental restructure she'd been putting off, and 2 sessions with Patricia that left her tired in the specific way that physical work left her tired, which was different from the way mental work did and not entirely unpleasant. The weeks were full. She thought about the garage anyway. She thought about it specifically when Diane called on a Sunday afternoon and asked, the way Diane asked things, direct, without apology, how she was actually doing. "Define actually," Victoria said. "You know what I mean. Not CEO doing, human doing." Victoria was on the couch with a book she'd been reading the same paragraph of for the past 20 minutes. "I met someone interesting." Interesting like, not like that. A mechanic. He fixes wheelchairs. We talked. She paused. He gave up industrial design to raise his daughter alone. Diane was quiet for a moment. "That's a very specific piece of information to volunteer. He mentioned it, and you're mentioning it to me. You asked how I was doing. I didn't ask about the mechanic." "I'm explaining how I'm doing," Victoria said. "That's part of it." Diane made a sound that meant she was smiling. "What's his name?" "Ethan Walker. He has a garage on Clement Street." "Are you going back?" "He asked me to come back in 2 weeks for a follow-up, and he's going to look at a custom mount for my painting bag." There was a longer silence. "Victoria," Diane said, "don't. I wasn't going to say anything." "You were absolutely going to say something." "I was going to say," Diane said, "that it's good you're thinking about the painting bag. That's all." Victoria looked at the book in her lap. "He asked me why I stopped painting. I didn't answer." "But you wanted to." She didn't say anything to that. "Okay," Diane said. "Tell me about the company. What's the contract situation?" Victoria talked about the contract situation for 35 minutes, and Diane listened with her characteristic mixture of genuine interest and well-placed questions. And when they hung up, Victoria sat for another few minutes in the quiet of the apartment. Then she got up and went to the closet in the second bedroom. She opened it. The canvas bag was where she'd left it, on the upper shelf, the shoulder strap hanging over the edge. She reached up and pulled it down and unzipped it and looked at the dried paint tubes and the brushes that needed reconditioning and the uncleaned palette. She didn't do anything with them. She just looked at them for a while. Then she put the bag on the floor beside the closet door, where she would have to see it, and she went back to the couch and the book she'd been reading and tried the paragraph again. This time she got through it. Tetem. She arrived at the garage on a Thursday, 2 weeks almost to the day. The rolling door was open again. The speaker was playing something different this time, Soto, something quieter, a piano record she didn't recognize. And Ethan was at the workbench, bent over something with a set of calipers. A child was sitting in the corner of the garage on a three-legged stool, doing homework on a clipboard with the focused intensity of someone who had been told to do homework and was doing it, but not happily. The child looked up when Victoria came in. She was maybe 8 or 9, with dark hair and 2 uneven braids that suggested a father who had learned to do braids because it was necessary and had gotten adequate if not expert at it, and she had her father's eyes, the same focused quality, the same directness. She looked at Victoria with honest curiosity and no particular self-consciousness. "Hi," the child said. "Hi," Victoria said. Ethan straightened up. "That's Maya. She doesn't have school today." "Professional Development Day," Maya said, with the specific disdain of a 9-year-old who had heard this phrase too many times to find it credible. "Right," Ethan said. He sounded like someone who had also heard this explanation too many times. "Come in, let me look at the chair, and then we'll talk about the mount." Victoria came in. She'd brought the canvas bag and the paint case, both on her lap, which had been a slightly awkward drive. She held them up. Ethan took them and set them on the workbench. He began to examine the chair first, checking the bearing housing, testing the wheel under light resistance, asking her about what she'd noticed over the past 2 weeks. "Nothing concerning," she told him. The wobble was gone. The chair handled better than it had since she'd gotten it. He seemed satisfied in the quiet way he was satisfied by things. Then he turned to the bag and the case. He spent a long time with them. He didn't ask a lot of questions at first. He just looked and held them and moved them around in the space near the chair's side and back. At one point, he got a tape measure. At another point, he found the pencil that had apparently been behind his ear again and made notes on a pad of paper that had seen significant use, his handwriting small and precise. "What's in the case?" Maya said. "Painting supplies?" Victoria said. Maya turned fully around on the stool. "Are you an artist?" "I used to be. Why did you stop?" "Maya," Ethan said, without looking up from the tape measure. "It's a reasonable question," Victoria said. She looked at Maya. "I had an accident. After that, it was hard to get back to it." Maya considered this with the unsentimental pragmatism of children. "But you're bringing your paint stuff here. I'm getting the bag fixed so I can carry it better." "So you are going back to it." Victoria opened her mouth and then closed it. She looked at the bag on the workbench. "Maybe," she said. Maya nodded as if this confirmed a theory she'd already had, and turned back to her homework. Ethan glanced up briefly and said nothing, and went back to measuring. He showed her the sketch at the end of the visit. It was on a fresh page from the notepad, a clean, precise drawing that took her a moment to parse, and then resolved into something that made her look up at him. "It mounts here," he said, pointing to the left armrest bracket. "The angle puts it within reach without interfering with your stroke. The paint case has its own bracket on the back, lower than center of gravity so it won't affect handling. Both can be detached in about 4 seconds. He paused. "I can build it out of the same titanium as the frame or Go lighter with aluminum. Aluminum's fine unless you're in rain regularly." She looked at the sketch for a long time. It was a good design, not just functional, actually well conceived, the mounting points chosen with obvious understanding of how wheelchair movement worked and how a right-handed person would reach for something on their left side. The lines on the paper were quick and confident, the kind of sketch that came from someone who understood what they were drawing in 3 dimensions. "You drew this in 20 minutes, she said. "I knew what I was looking for once I had the dimensions." "Ethan," she looked at him. "This is good design work." He did the thing he'd done the last time, that brief almost dismissal, the instinct to minimize. And then he stopped himself. She watched him stop himself. "It gets the job done," he said, but without as much conviction as before. "Come back in 10 days, he said. "I'll have it built." Victoria looked at the sketch again. She was thinking about the closet,
the dried paint, the uncleaned palette. "Okay," she said. Maya from the corner, without looking up from her homework. "Are you going to bring a finished painting sometime? I want to see what you paint." "Maya," Ethan started. "It's fine," Victoria said. She looked at the child. "Give me some time." "How much time?" "I don't know yet." Maya appeared to accept this as a reasonable answer. She turned back to her worksheet. Victoria looked at the open garage door, at the late afternoon light coming in low and amber across the concrete floor, at the photographs on the corkboard with their careful modifications and their quiet dignity. 10 days, she said to Ethan. 10 days, he confirmed. She went home. She didn't open the closet. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time. Then she got up, went to the second bedroom, picked up the canvas bag from the floor where she'd left it 2 weeks ago, brought it to the kitchen table, and started sorting through which brushes could be reconditioned and which ones were past saving. It was a small thing. It wasn't painting. She wasn't ready for painting yet. But it was something. Outside, the city moved through its evening the way it always did, indifferent and continuous, and the light over Crestwood changed from amber to blue to dark. And in the kitchen of an apartment on Orchard Street, a woman who hadn't painted in 11 months sat at a table and cleaned a brush with the careful attention of someone who was beginning, very slowly, to remember why it had mattered. The brushes took 3 evenings. Not because there were so many of them, there were 11, a mix of flats and rounds and one large fan brush she'd bought impulsively at an art supply store in Portland 2 years before the accident and used exactly once. But because she kept stopping, she'd get through 2 or 3 working the conditioner into the bristles with the careful repetitive motion that had always been meditative when she was painting regularly, and then she'd set them down and find herself just sitting there, not thinking about anything in particular, just present in the quiet kitchen with the city outside and the smell of linseed oil conditioner doing something to her that she couldn't quite name. The paint tubes were mostly a loss. Dried and cracked at the necks, the oil separated out into a clear stain on the inside of the canvas bag. She made a list of what needed replacing: titanium white, raw umber, cadmium yellow, the phthalo blue she'd mixed almost everything from. And then she folded the list and put it in her wallet without deciding what she was going to do with it. The palette she soaked overnight in solvent and cleaned the next morning. It came out usable, the old paint lifting in brittle sheets that she collected and threw away. When she was done, it looked the way it had when she first bought it, plain wooden oval, the surface stained faintly with ghost colors she couldn't quite identify anymore. She didn't buy new paints, not yet. She put the cleaned palette and the reconditioned brushes back in the canvas bag and put the bag in the second bedroom, not in the closet this time, but on the desk where she could see it from the door. That felt like enough for now. Ethan had the mount finished in 9 days, which she found out because he sent a text. Gerald had passed along her number, that read, "Done early if you want to come by Thursday instead. No punctuation, no greeting, the kind of message a person sent when they were used to communicating information without decoration." She texted back Thursday works and spent the next day in back-to-back meetings about the municipal contract renewal that ran long in the way that meetings with lawyers always ran long, her head full of indemnification clauses and performance benchmarks. And she found herself in the middle of a discussion about liability language, thinking about a sketch on a notepad. She stopped thinking about it and paid attention to the liability language. She was still good at that, compartmentalizing, focusing, doing the work in front of her. The accident had taken a lot of things, but it hadn't taken that. If anything, it had sharpened it, the way certain losses sharpened rather than dulled, the way knowing the cost of distraction made you less likely to be distracted. Thursday afternoon, she drove to Clement Street. The mount was better than the sketch had suggested, which was saying something because the sketch had been good. The main bracket sat flush against the left armrest without any modification to the chair's existing hardware. He'd engineered it to interface with the existing bolt pattern, which she hadn't expected and which represented either significant forethought or a particular kind of mechanical intuition that made the same thing possible. The bag hung at the angle he'd drawn, close enough to reach easily, far enough from the wheel path that there was no interference. The paint case bracket on the back was lower than she'd anticipated, and when she transferred to the chair and loaded both pieces and took 3 strokes across the garage floor, the balance was essentially unaffected. She stopped, took a longer run toward the door and back, making a tight turn. Ethan was watching from the workbench, not performing patience, but actually patient, his arms crossed loosely, a slight tension in the way he held himself that suggested he was actually waiting for her verdict. "The turn radius isn't compromised," she said. "I ran the numbers twice, still wanted to see it live." He paused. "How's the reach?" She unzipped the bag from the writing position and reached in. Perfect angle. She didn't have to lean forward or twist her torso. "Good," she said. "Really good." "Try loading the actual case." She transferred back to her car seat, loaded both items, she'd brought the bag and the empty paint case, and transferred back to the chair. The process of loading was straightforward. The detachment he'd described, 4 seconds, was actually closer to 3. She sat with it for a moment. The last time she'd carried painting supplies anywhere, she'd been walking. She'd had both hands free and a shoulder strap, and she'd been able to set things down and pick them up without thinking about it. This was different, but it was functional in a way that didn't feel like a compromise. It felt like a solution that had been thought about properly rather than slapped together. "You spent a lot of time on this," she said. "It was an interesting problem." He said it like he meant it, not like he was being modest. Maya was not in the garage today. School was in session, and without her the space had a different quality. Quieter. More like a workshop and less like a place where life was actively happening in multiple registers simultaneously. "It's good design," Victoria said again. This time he didn't dismiss it. He looked at the mount with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. Not pride, exactly. Something more complicated. "I've been thinking about what you said," he said, "about practical and design not being mutually exclusive." She waited. "I don't know what I'd do with a design program now, realistically. I'm not 22. He picked up a wrench from the bench and turned it over in his hands without purpose. "But I pulled out some old sketches last week, stuff from the program, looked at them. And? Some of it's pretty bad." He set the wrench down. "Some of it isn't." "What did you do with it?" "Put it back in the folder." He paused. "But I pulled out a fresh page and drew something that night, just to see." She looked at the photograph corkboard. The modifications, the custom frames, the careful engineering translated into real objects that real people used. "What did you draw?" "A design for a modular attachment system, for manual chairs specifically, something adaptable across different frame geometries instead of custom-built every time." He seemed to hear himself and stopped. "It's probably not practical." "Is it good?" He considered. "It's interesting." "Those aren't different things either," Victoria said. He looked at her with that look again, the one from the first visit, the real looking. Then he turned away and busied himself with something on the workbench, and the moment passed. "Well, she bought new paints that weekend. She didn't make a production of it. She drove to the art supply store on Ferris Street, one she'd used before the accident, a small independent shop run by a man named Howard who'd been selling paint and canvas to Crestwood artists since before she was born. And she went in and bought titanium white and raw umber and cadmium yellow and phthalo blue and a small bottle of linseed oil and 3 tubes of colors she hadn't planned on, but that she picked up and couldn't put back. Quinacridone rose, ivory black, yellow ochre. Howard, who was in his mid-60s and had the comfortable economy of movement of someone who'd been in the same space for decades, greeted her without visible surprise and helped her reach the top shelf where the larger titanium white tubes were kept. He didn't mention anything about the time since her last visit. He didn't ask if she was getting back into it. He talked about a new line of linen canvas he'd just gotten in, whether she wanted to look at it, and she looked at it and bought 2 medium-sized panels because they were in stock, and because she didn't want to think too hard about the decision. She got home and put everything on the desk in the second bedroom. She looked at it for a while. Then she sat down, mixed a small amount of raw umber with linseed oil on the cleaned palette, picked up a round brush, and made a single mark on one of the linen panels. A test mark. Just to feel it. The bristles responded the way they always had. The paint moved the way paint moved. Her hand remembered the pressure without being told. She sat back and looked at the mark on the panel. It was an unremarkable mark. A curved line, slightly thicker at one end where she'd started. It wasn't anything yet. It was barely a beginning. She sat with it for probably 20 minutes. Then she made another mark. But she didn't mention it to anyone right away. Not to Diane, who would respond with cautious enthusiasm in a way that would make Victoria feel observed. Not to Patricia, who would frame it in terms of recovery outcomes and milestone progress. She kept it private the way she'd always kept painting private, a thing that existed before language could get to it and diminish it with description. What she did instead was go back to the garage. There was no scheduled appointment. The follow-up check from the bearing repair was done, and the mount was installed, and there was no technical reason to return to Clement Street. She told herself she was going because she wanted to ask Ethan about a slight sound the rear caster made on rough concrete, which was true in a minor key. There was a faint sound. And not the main reason she went, which she didn't fully examine. It was a Tuesday evening. The garage was open. Ethan was there. He was not alone. There was another customer, a teenager, maybe 15, in a manual chair with the particular aggressive customization of someone who'd decided to make the chair theirs rather than functional generic. The frame was painted a flat black with silver hardware, and there was a small sticker on the right push rim that Victoria couldn't read from the door. The teenager's name, she gathered over the next few minutes, was Dominic, and he had the wary, cool manner of teenagers who'd learned to perform indifference as protection. Ethan was adjusting something on the anti-tip mechanism, talking to Dominic while he worked in the same matter-of-fact way he talked to everyone, not treating him like he was young, not talking around him, just talking to him about the chair. The geometry's fine, but you've been hitting curbs hard enough that it's shifting. You can feel it, right? In the left side. Dominic shrugged. Little bit. Little bit means it's been happening for a while and you got used to it. That's worse. It's not a big deal. It's also not a small deal. Give me 10 minutes. Victoria waited near the door. Dominic looked at her with the quick assessment of a teenager categorizing a stranger, registered the chair, recalibrated. You come here regular? He said. It was directed at her. A few times, Victoria said. He good? Yes. Dominic seemed to find this satisfactory. He looked at Ethan's hands. My school wants me to use their loaner chair for the basketball program. Says the modifications on mine are liability concerns. Ethan snorted. Not a polite, restrained sound, an actual snort. Which modification specifically? The push rim grip tape and the backrest angle. The backrest angle is a documented ergonomic adjustment. I know that. I told them that. And? Dominic's expression said everything about how that conversation had gone. Ethan looked up briefly. I can write up the specifications, show them it's within standard parameters. He paused. You want to play? Obviously. Then let's fix the anti-tip and I'll write the specs this week. Bring your school's contact info. Dominic was quiet for a moment. Why? Because your chair is correct and their loaner probably isn't. Ethan said it simply. And you should get to play. Something moved across Dominic's face, quickly, controlled, the way expressions moved across the faces of people who'd learned to manage them publicly. But it was there. Victoria looked at the corkboard. She thought about the modular attachment system Ethan had described, the design he'd drawn on a fresh page and then put away. She thought about 63 people and a $14 million revenue and how neither of those things had ever looked at her the way this mechanic looked at a kid who wanted to play basketball. Dominic left about 15 minutes later with the anti-tip properly aligned and Ethan's phone number written on a receipt for the specifications letter. Ethan washed his hands at the utility sink and came over to where Victoria was waiting. The caster, he said. It's minor, she said. Rough concrete. I think it might just be the surface. He crouched and listened while she moved across the garage floor. Yeah, he said. It's the caster bearing housing, not the axle. Probably another month before you actually need it replaced. He stood. You didn't come for the caster. She looked at him. Not the main reason, he said, and left it there. Victoria was quiet for a moment. I started painting again. He kept his expression level, but something in it, some small-held thing, released. Yeah? 2 nights ago, first time in 11 months. She paused. It was nothing. A test. 2 marks on a panel. Still, it's not the exhibition pieces I used to do. I don't know if that ever comes back. Does it have to? She considered that. I've been thinking about what you said, about looking at the old sketches. I said some of it was bad. You said some of it wasn't. She looked at him steadily. Have you drawn anything else since the attachment system? He walked to the workbench and pulled a pad of paper from under a parts catalog without making a thing of it. He set it down. She wheeled forward and looked. There were 3 pages. Pencil sketches, quick but precise. The attachment system he'd described, developed further now, with multiple frame geometry variations noted in small, clear lettering. But there were also 2 other drawings on the 3rd page. One was an abstract study, geometric, the kind of thing that came from someone thinking on paper rather than designing for a purpose. The other was a rendering of what appeared to be a workbench organization system, wall-mounted, modular, with a clean visual logic that was clearly thinking about aesthetics alongside function. The workbench system in the sketch looked nothing like the workbench in the garage. The garage workbench worked, but it was accumulated rather than designed. The sketch version was what the same mind might build if it had time and intention instead of urgency and pragmatism. These are good, Victoria said. It's just sketching. Ethan, she looked up at him. I'm not saying this because I think you need encouragement. I'm saying it because I run a company where I've hired a lot of people, and I know what it looks like when someone has genuine ability. She looked back at the sketch. You have genuine ability. He sat down on the stool near the workbench. He didn't say anything for a moment. Maya asked me last week why I never show my drawings to anyone, he said. What did you tell her? I said it was just for me. He looked at the pad. She said that was sad. Victoria almost laughed. A real laugh, not the social kind. 9-year-olds. 8. She turned 8 in September. 8-year-olds. She looked at the sketches again. She's not wrong. No, he said. She usually isn't. He said it with the specific, exhausted affection of a parent who'd been outwitted too many times to maintain the pretense of being in charge. Outside, Clement Street was doing its evening thing. The taqueria had its lights on. Somewhere nearby, someone was running a power tool. A neighbor doing something domestic on a Tuesday evening, the ordinary sounds of people living their lives. There's a community workshop, Victoria said, over on Kendall Street. I drove past it last week. They do materials and space rental for independent artists and designers. She had driven past it, though she hadn't slowed down. She had noticed it in the way she was noticing certain things now, filing them away with a purpose she hadn't fully articulated yet. I looked it up. They do evening sessions. Ethan looked at her carefully. I have Maya most evenings. They do Saturday mornings. He was quiet. I'm usually open Saturday mornings. If you weren't? She said it carefully, not pushing, just placing the question where he could look at it. He picked up the pencil that seemed to live behind his ear and turned it over in his fingers. I don't know, he said, and then, I'd probably think about it. That's further than I put it back in the folder, Victoria said. Something moved at the corner of his mouth, not quite the lopsided, almost smile from before. Something closer. How's the painting going? He said. Really? She thought about the linen panel on the desk in the second bedroom, the 2 marks, and then the others that had followed over 2 evenings. A composition building slowly, nothing certain yet, nothing she was sure of. The way her hand had moved with more certainty on the second night than the first. The way she'd stayed in the chair at the desk for an hour and a half without noticing the time. It's terrifying, she said. Yeah? Every mark feels like a test I might fail. She paused. It wasn't like that before. Before it felt not easy, exactly, but natural. Like the marks wanted to be there. And now? Now I have to argue them onto the canvas. She looked at her hands, which she sometimes still did, checking that they worked, that they were hers. But I'm arguing. That's different from not showing up, Ethan said. That's what I keep telling myself. He stood up from the stool and picked up the sketch pad and set it back under the parts catalog, which was either habit or something else. She thought it was something else. She thought he was still working out whether to let the drawings be visible. She understood that. She understood it specifically. Come by Saturday, he said. Not for the chair. There's nothing wrong with the chair that needs attention this week. He seemed to realize he was rescinding the premise of her visit. I mean, whenever. Maya usually makes me buy groceries on Saturday, so we're out by 11, but after that... I'll bring coffee, Victoria said. I have coffee. You have coffee that you make in a pot on a hot plate that's been on for 4 hours. He paused. How do you know that? She glanced at the hot plate visible on the far end of the workbench, the old coffee pot with its level indicator showing a dark residue. Mechanic's coffee, she said. I've seen it before. For the first time, he laughed. A real one, brief and unguarded, and it changed his face completely. It made him look younger and less contained and like someone who had more laughter in him than he let out on a regular basis. Fine, he said. Bring coffee. She went home that night and sat, in the doorway of the second bedroom for a long time, looking at the desk where the linen panel was propped against the wall. In the low light, she could barely make out what was there. The emerging composition, the layers she'd built over 2 evenings, the marks she'd argued onto the surface. It wasn't good yet. It might not be good for a while. She was 11 months out from practice, and the hand that remembered technique didn't automatically remember vision, the ability to see what a painting wanted to be rather than just what she was forcing it to be. She went to her laptop instead. She typed into the search bar, Crestwood Regional Art Exhibition Open Call. The first result was a Community Arts Foundation event. Annual juried exhibition, she read. All media, all levels of experience. Submissions due in 6 weeks. She looked at the submission form for a long time. She didn't fill it out. She closed the laptop and went to bed. But she lay awake for a while in the dark, thinking about the submission deadline, thinking about 6 weeks, thinking about a linen panel on a desk and the specific feeling of marks that had to be argued onto a surface, thinking that arguing was not nothing, that arguing was, in fact, the beginning of something. She didn't know what it was yet. She wasn't ready to say. But she lay there in the dark with the city moving quietly outside and felt, for the first time in 11 months, something that was not hope exactly. She was too careful for hope right now, too aware of what it cost when it didn't pay out. But it was close to something. It was in the neighborhood. She turned over, pulled the blanket up, and let the night go quiet around her. 6 weeks was not enough time, and also exactly enough time. Victoria figured this out around week 3, when the first linen panel was finished, and she hated it. Not the productive kind of hate that meant something was almost right and needed pushing. The flat, certain hate of recognizing that she'd painted defensively. The whole composition was technically competent and emotionally inert. The marks she'd argued onto the surface had won the argument and lost the point. She stood the panel against the wall, looked at it for 2 days from various angles and distances and lighting conditions, and then she turned it face in against the wall and started on a second panel. The second one was harder and better. She wasn't sleeping well. This was partly the painting. She'd start an evening session at 8 and surface at midnight, surprised by the time. And partly something she couldn't attribute to a specific cause, a low-grade wakefulness that felt like her nervous system recalibrating to something she hadn't yet identified. She'd had a version of this feeling before, years ago, in the early months of building Sterling Tech, when the company was still a real risk and she was working on forward momentum and insufficient sleep and the particular electric anxiety of not knowing whether the thing she was building would hold. She recognized it now as the feeling of having stakes again. Patricia, at their session in week 4, looked at her with the careful attention of someone trained to read what people didn't say. You seem different. Different how? Less managed. Victoria considered this. I'm painting again. Seriously, not just handling the tools. Patricia was quiet for a moment, and her quiet had the quality of someone choosing not to say the first several things that came to mind. How does it feel? Like I'm failing twice a day and getting back up twice a day. That's a significant change from 4 weeks ago. 4 weeks ago, I wasn't getting up or falling down. I was just holding still. Patricia made a note. Victoria watched her make it and didn't ask what it said. She'd been going to the garage on Saturdays. It had become a thing without being decided as a thing, which was how she preferred arrangements. Organic enough that they didn't carry the weight of commitment, functional enough that they actually happened. She'd bring coffee, real coffee from the shop on Meridian that did proper espresso drinks rather than drip. Ethan would open the garage around 9:30 after dropping Maya at a weekend activity. Swimming lessons, she'd learned, which Maya tolerated rather than enjoyed because she was, in her father's words, extremely competitive and not yet good enough to win, which was its own kind of difficult. The conversations had grown in the way that conversations grew when 2 people were paying attention and not performing. They talked about the work, both of them. Ethan had started going to the Kendall Street workshop on alternate Saturday mornings when Maya was at her lessons, which he mentioned in a way designed to sound casual and which wasn't. He'd shown her photographs of what he was working on there, the modular attachment system, built now in cardboard and foam board mock-up stage, the geometry working out the way his sketches had suggested it would. "It fits 4 different frame types already," he said one Saturday, holding his phone out so she could see the photos. Aluminum, steel, titanium, carbon fiber, with 1 design adjustment each, not a complete rebuild. "Have you shown it to anyone?" "You. Besides me." "No." He pocketed the phone. "It's not ready." "What's your benchmark for ready?" "I'll know it when I get there." She understood that. She was also not sure she believed it, for him or for herself. There was a version of not ready that meant the work genuinely needed more development, and there was a version that meant you were afraid of what happened after you showed it to someone and they told you the truth. Both versions were real. They were also not always easy to tell, apart from the inside. "The exhibition submission deadline is in 8 days, she said. Ethan looked at her. "You're submitting?" "I'm thinking about it." "That's different from 2 weeks ago." 2 weeks ago, I hadn't finished a second panel. She'd finished it 3 days earlier. It was good. She was reasonably sure it was good in an honest way, not in the way she'd once reassured herself that the defensive first panel was fine. The second panel had something in it, a tension between the color fields, a sense of weight in the composition, that felt like actual intention rather than careful execution. "I'd need a third to have enough to enter. The call requires a minimum of 2 finished works plus an artist statement. 3 panels in 8 days. I know." He drank his coffee and said nothing for a moment. "You could submit the first one." "No, I couldn't." He nodded. He'd seen a photograph of the first panel the week before. She'd shown him without much explanation, and he'd looked at it with the same focus he brought to wheelchair geometry, and then he'd said the technique is there, but you're not in it. And she'd felt a flash of irritation that had immediately converted into the recognition that he was right, and that someone being right was more useful than someone being kind. "Can I see the second one?" he said. She hadn't shown it to anyone yet. Not Diane, who would be supportive, not Patricia, who would contextualize it. She'd been keeping it private in the specific way she kept things private when she wasn't sure they could survive the exposure yet. She looked at Ethan, at the garage around him, the organized shelves, the photographs on the corkboard, the cardboard mock-up of his attachment system sitting on the corner of the workbench where she could see its clean geometric logic from across the room. She got out her phone and showed him. He took the phone and looked at it for a long time. Not the polite duration of looking, the real duration, the kind where the person was actually moving through the image. He tilted the screen slightly, the way you tilted a painting to see how the light read. "The lower left," he said. "The dark passage. That's where it's coming from." She knew what he meant without him explaining it. The dark passage in the lower left quadrant was where she'd stopped being careful and started being honest, and everything else in the composition was in dialogue with that choice. "Yeah?" she said. "The third panel should start there." He handed the phone back. Not literally, but from that same place. Neat. She looked at the image on her screen. 8 days. "You're fast when you're not being careful," he said. It was not a criticism. "You told me that. You said before the accident you'd sometimes work for 6 hours straight without looking up." "That was before." "Your hands still work the same way." "My hands aren't the problem." "I know that," he said, and his voice had a gentleness in it that wasn't soft. It was the gentleness of precision, of saying exactly what was meant. "You're the problem. The part of you that's still waiting for permission." She looked at him. "You don't need it," he said. "You didn't need it before. Before was different." "Was it?" He picked up his coffee cup. "From where I'm standing, you were always the person who built a company on $60,000 and unreasonable confidence. That person is still in there. She's just been quiet for a while." Victoria was silent for a moment. Outside, a car passed on Clement Street. The morning light was doing its low-angle thing through the garage door, the same quality she'd noticed on the first visit, the kind that made everything look like it was being seen for the first time. "I hate when you do that," she said. "Do what?" "Say the thing that's actually true." He almost smiled. You do the same thing. I know, it's annoying. This time he did smile. The lopsided one, brief, real. He stood up from the workbench stool and went back to the wheelchair he'd been working on before she arrived, a pediatric chair that needed a complete bearing overhaul, and Victoria sat with her coffee and thought about a third panel and the feeling of starting from the place in the lower left where she'd stopped being careful. She drove home that afternoon and started it the same evening. The third panel nearly broke her on day 3. She'd been working from the right place. She could feel that. The same way she could feel when a business decision was rooted in real analysis versus wishful thinking. The composition had a rawness she hadn't been able to achieve on the first panel and was building on from the second. But on day 3, she made a color decision in the upper register that threw the whole thing off balance. A cadmium passage that was wrong in a way she couldn't immediately diagnose. And she put the brush down and sat back and looked at it for 40 minutes without touching it. The city outside was doing its Wednesday evening thing. Her phone had 2 unread texts from department heads, one from Diane asking if she was alive, and a meeting reminder for the next morning's contract review. She looked at all of it and looked back at the painting. The cadmium was too loud, not wrong in its temperature, wrong in its weight. It was pulling focus in the upper quadrant in a way that broke the diagonal conversation the composition was trying to have. She'd have to glaze over it, cool it down, let the underpainting reassert itself. She could fix it. She knew she could fix it. But knowing and doing were separated right now by the specific exhaustion of caring deeply about something that might still fail, and she sat there in that gap for a while. Her phone lit up. Not a text. A call. Ethan's name on the screen, which surprised her because they'd communicated mostly by occasional text and in person on Saturdays. She picked up. "You're working," he said. Not a question. "I was. I made a mistake. I'm sitting with it." Bad mistake or fixable mistake? Fixable, she paused. Probably. Probably fixable is fine. There was background noise on his end. The clink of dishes, which meant he was in the kitchen, which meant Maya was around somewhere. "I'm calling because Maya wants to know if you're submitting." "Maya wants to know?" "She asked me today at dinner if the painting lady was putting her work in the show downtown. Apparently someone at her school mentioned it, and she connected the dots." Victoria looked at the painting, the loud cadmium passage in the upper register, the composition that was fighting itself at the moment and might resolve or might not, the 5 days left before the submission deadline. "Tell her I'm working on it," Victoria said. "That's a yes?" "That's a working on it." A brief pause, then quieter, probably away from Maya. "For what it's worth, I think you should." "Why?" "Because you've been painting for 3 weeks and you're already talking about the work the way serious people talk about work. That's not nothing." She thought about the second panel, the lower left quadrant where she'd stopped being careful. "I'm scared," she said. It came out simply, without the self-consciousness she'd have expected. "Yeah," he said. "Me too, actually." She waited. "I sent the concept drawings for the attachment system to a disability design publication, online journal. Just the concept stage, not the mock-up." He said it in the even tone he used when something was actually not even. "When?" "This afternoon. Maya was at swimming. I did it before I could talk myself out of it." A pause. "I haven't told anyone else." Victoria sat with that for a moment, the act of it, sending something out before you could stop yourself, trusting the work enough to let it be seen. She understood what it had cost him. "That's the real thing," she said. "That's the beginning." "Maybe." He was quiet. "Submit the paintings. I'll call you when I fix the cadmium problem. I'll be up late." She hung up and picked up the brush and mixed a transparent glaze, phthalo blue, and a drop of linseed oil, thin enough to cool the cadmium without burying it, and she began. She worked until 2 in the morning. When she finally set the brush down, the upper register had found its place in the conversation, the diagonal moving properly now, the composition saying what she'd meant for it to say. She was tired in the specific way that real work made you tired, the kind that felt like honesty rather than depletion. She texted Ethan, fixed it. He texted back 4 minutes later, which meant he had actually been awake. Told you. She went to bed and slept without interruption for the first time in 3 weeks. On. She submitted on day 7 with 1 day to spare because she spent day 7 writing and rewriting the artist statement until she had something that was true without being confessional. She didn't write about the accident. She wrote about what it meant to make a mark you couldn't take back, and how every painting she'd ever made had been a negotiation between what she intended and what the work wanted to be, and how she'd learned after a long absence that the negotiation didn't wait for you to feel ready. It started when you showed up. She reread it twice, changed 3 words, and hit submit. Then she sat in the quiet of the second bedroom with the 3 panels arranged against the wall, the turned-around first one still face in, the second and third panels out, and she felt something she didn't immediately have a name for. Not relief. Not quite. More like the particular exhaustion satisfaction of having done a thing that mattered rather than a thing that was required. She told Diane that evening. Diane was quiet for approximately 2 seconds and then said, with the directness that was her defining characteristic, "I need to see them." "Not yet." "Victoria, when they're hanging in the gallery, if they're accepted." "When they're accepted." "I can't think that far ahead." "I can do it for you." A brief pause. "Who else knows?" "Ethan. His daughter Maya, apparently." "The mechanic." Diane's voice had the quality it got when she was assembling information. "You're close." "We talk." "You told him you were scared before you told me." Victoria was quiet for a moment. "I told him because I didn't need to explain the context." "I know," Diane said, without sharpness. "That's what I mean." And they talked about other things after that. Diane's job, a trip she was planning, the contract review that Victoria had gotten through the next morning. And when they hung up, Victoria sat in the apartment and thought about what Diane had meant and didn't mean, and about the particular value of people who asked straight questions and waited for straight answers. Tech. The notification arrived 11 days later, on a Wednesday morning when Victoria was in the middle of a departmental budget review that she'd been running since 8. Her phone was face down on the conference table, the way she kept it during meetings where she needed to actually be present. She felt it vibrate twice, the pattern for an email. She left it. 40 minutes later, when the meeting broke and people were gathering laptops and coffee cups and doing the small social negotiations of ending a work session, she picked it up. The email was from the Crestwood Arts Foundation. The subject line read, "Exhibition Submission. Response." She looked at the subject line for a moment. Around her, 3 of her department heads were having a conversation about a timeline that she was nominally part of. She was aware of their voices the way you were aware of ambient sound. Present, registered, not processed. She opened the email. "Dear Ms. Sterling, we are pleased to inform you that your submission has been selected for inclusion in this year's Crestwood Regional Art Exhibition." She read it twice. Then she set the phone face down again and said to the 3 department heads who were discussing a timeline she'd signed off on 6 weeks ago, "The completion date needs to move up by 2 weeks. We have the capacity and the client will appreciate it. Let's talk through the implications this afternoon." The department heads looked at her with the slight recalibration of people receiving information they hadn't expected. She was careful not to show anything on her face, not because she was suppressing it, because it was hers for now, and she wanted to keep it that way for a little while. She texted Ethan from the hallway while she was walking back to her office. They accepted the work. He texted back before she reached her door. "I know." She stopped walking, typed, "How do you know?" His response, "Because it's good. I've seen it." She stood in the hallway of the 14th floor of the Aldridge building and looked at her phone. Through the window at the end of the corridor, she could see the city below. Crestwood doing its midday thing, the streets moving, the unremarkable ordinary continuity of a city that didn't know or care that something small and significant had just happened in its arts calendar. She typed, "The Journal. Heard back yet?" 3 minutes passed, then, "This morning. They want to feature the concept. Asked if I have a working prototype." She read this twice. Then she typed, "Do you?" His response, "The cardboard mock-up isn't a prototype." "Give it a month," she typed back. She put her phone in her pocket and walked back to her office and spent the next 6 hours doing the work that 63 people and a $14 million revenue required of her. She did it well. She'd always been able to do it well. But for the first time in 11 months, the doing it well didn't feel like the whole story. The night before the exhibition opening, she went to the gallery. It was a standard early access for participating artists, an hour to see the hung work before the public opening the next day, a practical chance to confirm nothing had been damaged in installation. Victoria had been told her pieces were in the East Room, toward the far wall. The gallery was the Crestwood Arts Foundation building on Whitmore Street. Not large, not prestigious in any national sense, a regional institution with good light and decent wall space, and a reputation for giving emerging artists a real showing rather than a token one. She'd been in the building once before the accident, for a member event she'd attended, and mostly spent thinking about a contract proposal. The East Room was a medium-sized gallery space with white walls and good overhead lighting and the faint institutional smell of climate-controlled air and floor wax. Her two panels, the second and third, the ones that were actually finished, were hung side by side near the far wall, framed simply, the frames chosen from the gallery's standard options because she'd never needed to buy frames for anything that would hang publicly and hadn't known where to start. She crossed the room and stopped in front of them. She hadn't seen them in the 3 weeks since submission. She'd moved them to a storage facility rather than keep living with them, a decision she'd made partly to protect them and partly because she'd needed to stop looking at them in order to see them clearly later. They looked different on the wall than they'd looked in the second bedroom. The East Room light was better than what she had at home, more even, properly angled. And at this distance and in this context, they read as a pair in a way she hadn't planned, but that seemed now intentional. The lower left dark passage in the second panel rhymed with something in the upper right of the third that she hadn't noticed was a rhyme when she was working. She stayed in front of them for a while. An older man she didn't know paused beside her at one point, looked at the panels, said, "Very strong," these without looking at her, and moved on. She watched him go. She was not able to fully assess her own work. She knew this, had always known it, too close, too embedded in the history of what each mark had cost to see it the way a stranger saw it. But standing here, at this distance, in this light, with this person's unremarkable, genuine response still in the air, she thought, okay, not good. She wasn't ready to say good about her own work, not yet, maybe not ever without ambivalence. But okay in the sense of, this is real. This is actually here. I made it, and it exists, and it is not nothing. She texted Ethan a photograph of the hanging. He called instead of texting back. "Those frames are wrong," he said by way of hello. "I know." The second panel especially. It needs something thinner. The frame's competing. "I'll know for next time." A pause on her end. "There's going to be a next time." He was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "I know." She could hear something in the background side, Maya's voice, the specific pitch of a child who was trying to argue past a reasonable boundary and not succeeding. Ethan said something away from the phone that she couldn't make out, and Maya's voice receded. "She wants to come tomorrow," Ethan said, "to the opening." Victoria looked at her panels on the wall. "Bring her. She'll have opinions." "I'm counting on it." A brief pause, then, "You okay?" She thought about the question, not the social version of it, not the check-in. The actual question, the one she'd been asked in a garage on Clement Street on the first day, the one she hadn't answered. "Getting there," she said. "Yeah," he said. "Me too." She hung up and stayed in the East Room for another 20 minutes, alone with the work and the good light and the quiet before everything changed. The opening night crowd was larger than Victoria had expected. She wasn't sure what she'd expected. 50 people, maybe. The core arts community crowd that showed up to these things out of habit and genuine interest, and the social ritual of being seen supporting culture. What the Crestwood Arts Foundation had drawn was closer to 140, filling the gallery's 3 rooms with the particular noise of people who were talking about art, and people who were talking about each other while standing near art, the two groups in continuous overlap. She arrived at 6:15, 15 minutes after doors opened, early enough to have a few minutes before the density became difficult to navigate. The East Room was already occupied, about a cluster of people near the entrance, a couple studying a large abstract canvas on the north wall, a man with a glass of wine reading the wall labels with the slightly performative attention of someone who wanted it known they were reading the wall labels. Her panels were where she'd left them the night before, on the far wall, lit the same way. From the doorway she could see them clearly. 2 rectangles, the dark passage in the second, the resolved upper register of the third, the frames that Ethan had correctly identified as wrong. She looked at them the way she looked at them now, honestly, with the acknowledged imperfection, knowing what they were and what they weren't. Victoria. She turned. Diane was threading through the crowd, wearing something dark red that suited her, holding 2 glasses. She held one out. "You came early," Victoria said. "I've been here since 6. Diane pressed the glass into her hand. "I needed time with them before you arrived so I could have an actual reaction without managing it around you." Victoria looked at her. "And?" Diane looked at the panels on the far wall. "The second one stopped me," she said. "That lower left section. I stood in front of it for about 4 minutes and someone had to excuse themselves around me." Victoria didn't say anything. "You're back," Diane said, simply, without drama. "That's all. You're back." Before Victoria could respond, a hand on her shoulder, light, careful. She turned to find Ethan, Maya, immediately beside him, Maya wearing what appeared to be her best dress, and an expression of concentrated appraisal that made her look, in this moment, significantly older than 8. "We parked 2 blocks away," Maya announced. "It took forever." "It took 8 minutes," Ethan said. "Forever." Maya's eyes were already moving around the room with the quick, systematic scan of someone cataloging everything before deciding what mattered. Then she located the panels on the far wall and went still. "Those are yours," she said. "Yes?" Maya walked directly toward them without waiting. Ethan watched her go, then looked at Victoria. He was wearing a jacket she'd never seen him in. Dark, clean, the kind of thing a person owned for occasions and wore slightly self-consciously. He looked like himself, but formally, the same way a place looks like itself when it's been cleaned up for company. "The frames are still wrong," he said. "Still noted." "The paintings aren't wrong." He said it without looking at her, watching Maya position herself in front of the second panel with her arms crossed and her head slightly tilted. "I wanted to tell you that separately from everything else." Victoria looked at her own work on the wall. "Thank you." "Not a compliment, an observation." "I know the difference," she said. "That's why I'm thanking you." Diane had materialized at Ethan's other side and was watching Maya with undisguised delight. "Is that her?" "That's Maya," Victoria said. "She's 8?" "8," Ethan confirmed. "She's going to say something worth remembering," Diane said. They watched Maya stand in front of the panels for a long moment. Then she turned and walked back to them with the purposeful stride of someone delivering a verdict. "The sad one is better," Maya said. "Which one do you think is the sad one?" Victoria said. Maya pointed without hesitation to the second panel, the one with the dark lower left passage, the one where Victoria had stopped being careful. "That one. But it doesn't make me feel sad. It makes me feel like the sad part is over." She paused, working something out. "Like when you're done crying and you feel empty, but okay." The small group was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," Victoria said, and her voice was steadier than she felt. "That's exactly what it is." Maya seemed satisfied. She turned to her father. "Can I have a snack? I saw a table." "In a minute." "Dad." "1 minute." Maya exhaled with theatrical patience and stood her ground. Ethan looked at Victoria. Something moved between them. A recognition. The particular kind that didn't need words because the words would have been less precise than the silence. "Go," Victoria said. "She's been patient." "She really hasn't," Ethan said. But he went. The announcement came at 8:45. By then, the East Room had thickened with people, and Victoria had spoken to 7 strangers about her work. The longest conversation with a woman named Carolyn, who ran a small design firm, and who asked specific, intelligent questions about process rather than meaning, which Victoria found easier to answer and more revealing, and had relocated twice to keep clear sightlines and good maneuver room. Her arms were tired from the navigation in a denser crowd than she normally handled, and she was on her second glass of water because she'd found early in her recovery that public events had an energy drain she hadn't had before and that she was still calibrating. She was near the East Room entrance, talking with Diane and a sculptor named Marcus, whose large ceramic work was in the West Room, when the Foundation's executive director, a compact woman in her 50s named Helen Cross, tapped a glass at the center of the main gallery. "Awards are announced at the 1-hour mark," Diane said. "I know." Victoria had read the program. There were 4 awards. Best in Show, 2 category honors, and Best Emerging Artist. The emerging category was for artists who had not previously shown in a juried exhibition. She technically qualified. She had also not thought seriously about the awards, because thinking seriously about awards was the kind of expectation setting that led to falls from significant heights, and she'd had enough of those. Helen Cross spoke briefly about the foundation, about the year's submissions, about the quality of the work. Standard remarks, the kind that were genuine but also practiced. Victoria listened from the doorway of the East Room, Diane beside her. The crowd redistributed around the central gallery space. The category honors first. A photographer named James Adler for his documentary series sustained applause, the man making his way to the front with a slight nod. A printmaker whose name Victoria didn't catch, but whose work she'd seen in the West Room and respected. Best Emerging Artist, Helen Cross said. The room had the particular quiet of people in a room together wanting the same category of thing, resolution, meaning, a moment to respond to. Victoria Sterling. She heard it clearly. There was no ambiguity, no almost sounding like. Her name, in the Whitmore Street Gallery, in front of 140 people. Diane made a sharp, small sound beside her and grabbed her arm, which was not a thing Diane did casually. Victoria didn't move for a second. The room had rearranged itself into a function of applause and turned faces, and the particular focused attention of a crowd given a direction to look. People near the East Room entrance shifted, creating a path. She looked across the room. Ethan was standing near the far wall with Maya beside him, and when their eyes met, he did something she hadn't seen him do before. He put his hand over his mouth briefly, like he was containing something, and then lowered it. Maya was already clapping with the uncomplicated enthusiasm of someone who had decided weeks ago that this outcome was the obvious one. Victoria moved toward the front. The navigation was not graceful. The crowd had opened up, but not entirely, and she had to ask twice for clearance, and there was a moment near the center where someone stepped back without looking, and she had to stop short. None of this was catastrophic. It was just real, the way things were real, and she moved through it with the competence she'd spent 11 months building. Helen Cross was at the front with an envelope and a small award, an abstract sculptural piece she could see, the kind of thing that would live on a shelf. She handed it to Victoria and leaned forward to say something that was clearly meant to be private under the applause. The judges specifically noted the second piece, Helen said, the lower left quadrant. They said it was one of the most honestly expressed passages of the entire show. Victoria held the sculptural award in both hands and looked at it for a moment. It was heavier than it appeared. This was the kind of detail she would remember later, the specific weight of it. She looked up at the crowd, at Diane, whose expression was the controlled version of everything she was feeling, at Ethan, who was watching with the steady attention he brought to things that mattered, at Maya, who had stopped clapping and was now just beaming in the uncomplicated way of someone for whom the outcome had never been in doubt. She didn't give a speech. Helen hadn't indicated one was expected, and even if it had been, she wasn't sure she had the words right now. Not the right words, the ones that were actually true rather than appropriate. She said thank you. She said she was glad the work was here, and she moved back. The rest of the evening moved differently after that. Not easier. She was tired by 9 and the crowd had not decreased, but with a quality she recognized from certain moments in the early days of Sterling Tech, when something was confirmed that she'd been working from intuition alone, and the confirmation didn't change the work, but changed the ground it stood on. A small but real shift in the quality of solid. Diane stayed close in the unobtrusive way she'd always managed, present without being a buffer, available without hovering. At one point she touched Victoria's shoulder and said quietly, "I'm going to get another drink and pretend I'm not crying," and walked away, which was the most Diane thing she'd ever said. Ethan found her near the East Room around 9:15, Maya finally agreeing to sit on a bench near the gallery entrance with Victoria's award on her lap, treating it with the responsible seriousness of a child who had been trusted with something important. She asked if she could hold it, Ethan said. "I heard. She's been lecturing people near the door about the exhibition for the past 20 minutes. What people? Strangers. Arriving strangers. She gives them an overview."
Victoria looked at Maya on the bench, holding the sculptural award carefully and watching the room with the concentrated engagement of someone who had found their purpose for the evening. She's going to be terrifying when she's older. She's already terrifying, Ethan said, but in the voice that meant the specific opposite. They stood together near the doorway of the east room, looking at the two panels on the far wall. The crowd had thinned slightly in this room, and from here, at this angle, with the evening behind them, the work looked like what it was. Imperfect, honestly made, present. Carolyn Marsh talked to me tonight, Victoria said. The woman who runs the design firm. I know who she is. She's been involved with the Accessible Design Coalition. They've been trying to get more visibility for adaptive product work. She mentioned the coalition. Victoria looked at him. She also asked about you. He turned his head. About me. She'd read the concept piece in the journal, the attachment system. She watched his expression go carefully neutral, the way it went when he was managing a response. The journal put your location in the byline. She recognized Crestwood. What did she say? She said the concept was solving a real problem in a way she hadn't seen approached that way. She asked if you'd be interested in connecting. Victoria paused. I gave her your number. I should have asked first. He was quiet for a moment. No, it's fine. He looked back at the panels. The cardboard mock-up is not a prototype. You said that. I still have about a month of work before it's anything I'd show a coalition. She's not expecting a finished product. She wants to talk about the direction. Victoria let that land. You sent the concept to a journal before you had a prototype. That was different. How was it different? He thought about it. She could see him thinking about it. The honest consideration rather than the reflexive response. It was easier to send something to a publication I'd never meet, he said. This is someone local, someone in the field. I know. She understood the distinction, the difference between sending work into the abstraction of a publication and having a real conversation with a real person who would ask real questions and expect real answers. It's scarier. Yeah. That's why it matters more. He looked at her sideways. You're doing the thing again. I know. You can do it back to me anytime. He was quiet for a moment. Then, the program you got into, the artist residency. She had mentioned it to him 2 weeks ago. The prestigious program on the East Coast, a 6-month artist residency for mid-career artists with demonstrated work. She'd applied without expecting to be considered seriously, with the same impulse that had made her submit to the exhibition, before she could talk herself out of it. She hadn't heard back yet. What about it? If you get in, Ethan said, that's 6 months. I know what 6 months is. You'd be good there. I might not get in. You're going to get in. He said it the way he said things that were observations rather than encouragements. I'm saying, when you do. That's 6 months away from the company. I have a management team. I've been building toward them being able to operate without me being physically present every day. That was a goal pre-accident that the accident actually accelerated, practically speaking. I'm not worried about the company. She looked at him. Then what are you saying? He looked at the floor for a moment. It was the closest thing to uncertainty she'd ever seen from him. Not the uncertainty of not knowing something, but the uncertainty of knowing something and not being sure whether to put it into words. I'm saying it'll be different, he said, without the Saturdays. The room was doing its late evening thing around them. The crowd at its lowest density now, the clink of the last wine glasses, gallery staff beginning their quiet cleanup preparations. The 2 panels on the far wall were lit the same way they'd been all evening, patient in the way that objects were patient. Victoria looked at the panels and then at Ethan. We have phones, she said. I know. And the Saturdays aren't going anywhere until I know whether I got in. Right. He nodded once. It was the kind of nod that meant yes, and also meant I hear more than just what you said, and also meant okay. The specific nod of someone who communicated efficiently enough that a single gesture could carry several things at once. Maya appeared at Ethan's elbow with the award, which she had apparently decided she was done guarding. The man by the door said the gallery closes at 10, she said. It's 9:43. I know how to tell time, Maya. Just in case. She held the award up to Victoria. Her expression had the seriousness back. You should have this. It's yours. Victoria took it. The weight again. She'd remember that. Thank you for holding it.
I told 4 people what it was for. Maya looked up at her. They all said congratulations. Thank you for that too. You're welcome. Maya looked between her father and Victoria with the calculating equanimity of an 8-year-old who understood more of what was happening around her than adults assumed. Are we going to get food? Dad said maybe after. Maybe after, Ethan confirmed. Dad always says maybe after, Maya said to Victoria. What does maybe after usually mean? Sometimes yes, and sometimes he's too tired. Maya assessed her father. He doesn't look too tired. Ethan rubbed his face. I'm not too tired. So yes? So yes, go get your coat. Maya went. Ethan watched her go and turned back, and he and Victoria were standing in the east room of the Whitmore Street Gallery, the crowd down to a dozen, the panels on the far wall going quiet in the gallery light. The taqueria's open late, he said. Victoria looked at the award in her lap, at the room, at Ethan in his jacket for occasions, which he'd mostly stopped looking self-conscious in over the course of the evening. I know a better place, she said, on Meridian, open until midnight. The one with the espresso. They do food too. He looked at her for a moment. Maya might interrogate you about the paintings the whole time. I know. She'll have questions about every decision you made. She's 8. She'll move on to something else after the first 5 minutes. You'd be surprised. But he said it like this was not actually a warning. Maya came back with her coat and stopped beside them, looking between the two of them with the brisk efficiency of someone who had been patient long enough. Ready? Ready, Victoria said. The 3 of them moved toward the gallery exit, through the last of the evening crowd, past the long-viewed paintings and the cleaned-up wine table and the gallery staff beginning to dim the non-essential lights. Victoria went first through the wide door, out into the Crestwood evening. Cool air, the street quiet in the way streets were quiet at 10 on a weeknight, the city doing its nighttime thing at low volume. She stopped on the sidewalk and tilted her head back slightly. The sky over Crestwood had the particular quality of a city sky in autumn. Not full dark, not fully lit, a deep blue that held everything without being anything specific. Ethan came out behind her with Maya. They stood on the sidewalk and he looked up at the same sky, following whatever she was looking at. Nice night, he said. Yeah. Maya, already thinking about food, was looking up the street for the car. Ethan was looking at the sky. Victoria was looking at the award in her lap and thinking about the East Coast and 6 months and the second panel and the lower left passage where she'd stopped being careful and what that had cost and what it had returned. She thought about a garage on Clement Street with its hand-painted sign and its corkboard photographs and a bearing housing that wobbled and a conversation that had started because a wheel wasn't tracking right. She thought about the specific weight of the object in her hands and how she would remember it. The weight and the light and the sidewalk and the unhurried sound of a man and his daughter walking beside her into the kind of ordinary evening that was, against all prior evidence, actually okay. The residency letter arrived 6 weeks later on a Tuesday morning in her work email at 8:47. She was at her desk on the 14th floor, 2 minutes before the morning's first meeting, her coffee going cold the way it always did before 9. She read the letter twice, which took 40 seconds, and then she sat for a moment and looked at the downtown Crestwood skyline through the window. The Aldridge building, in which she sat, was visible in its own reflection on the glass of the adjacent building, which always gave her the slight vertigo of seeing herself from the outside. She picked up her phone and called Ethan. He picked up on the third ring, the sound of the garage behind him, something mechanical, a radio at low volume. The residency, she said. A pause of 2 seconds. When do you leave? He said. She looked at the letter. January 15th. 2 months. 2 months. Another pause. Longer. She heard him set something down on the workbench, a tool, by the sound of it, placed with the deliberate care of someone giving their attention to the call. Carolyn Marsh wants to meet next week, he said, about the prototype. Did you call her? Yesterday? She let the silence have a moment. Outside, the Crestwood skyline did what it always did. Continued, indifferent, and familiar. Good, she said. You should come, he said. To the meeting, if you want. It's your meeting. I know. I'm saying if you want to come. She looked at the residency letter on her screen. at the city in the window, at the award from the Whitmore Street Gallery sitting on the corner of her desk, where she'd put it the morning after the opening and where it had remained. A small, dense weight that she was aware of without looking at directly. "Send me the time," she said. "Okay. And Ethan?" "Yeah." She wasn't sure what she was going to say. She sat with the not sureness for a moment, which was not a thing she usually allowed herself, the open air of an unfinished sentence. "Nothing," she said. "I'll see you Saturday." "Saturday," he said. She hung up and put the phone face down on the desk and looked at the residency letter for another moment. Then she opened her calendar and started working through what needed to happen in the next 2 months. The handoffs, the management structure, the contracts that needed to be buttoned up before January 15th. She was good at this. She'd always been good at making things work. Outside the window, Crestwood moved through its Tuesday morning the way it moved through everything. Without ceremony, without noticing, doing what it did. She drank her cold coffee and started building toward January. The 2 months before January 15th moved the way time moved when you had too much to do and too much to think about. Fast on the surface, slow underneath. Victoria managed the handoffs the way she managed everything, systematically, without sentimentality, with the particular efficiency of someone who had built the systems she was now stepping away from and knew exactly where each load-bearing wall was. Her operations director, a meticulous man named Garrett, who had been with Sterling Tech for 3 years, and who she had spent the last 18 months quietly and deliberately preparing for exactly this kind of expanded responsibility, took on the day-to-day with the composed confidence of someone who had been ready for longer than either of them had officially acknowledged. Her department heads had their directives. Her legal team had the contract frameworks. Her board had been briefed and had responded with the measured enthusiasm of people who had watched her navigate a recovery year and had concluded, probably correctly, that she was more dangerous with perspective than without it. The company would be fine. She knew this with the same certainty she knew the second panel was good. Not hope, not reassurance, but actual knowledge built from actual evidence. What was harder to manage was the rest of it. She painted in the 2 months before she left. Every weekend and most evenings when the workday didn't run past 9, which it did more often than it should have. She painted with the specific urgency of someone who had discovered they were capable of it again and was not yet convinced the capability would survive a change of context. She finished 4 more panels, 2 of which were good in the honest way. One of which was overworked and saved only partially, one of which she abandoned at the underpainting stage and turned face in against the wall where it would stay. She did not feel bad about the abandoned one. Abandonment was information. She'd learned that this year. She went to the Clement Street garage on Saturdays. This did not change until the Saturday before she left, which was the last one, and even then it didn't change in the way that endings changed. It changed the way things changed when they were not actually ending. The meeting with Carolyn Marsh had happened in November. Victoria had gone, as invited, and had sat in the corner of a conference room in Carolyn's design firm on Hawthorne Avenue, while Ethan presented the modular attachment system. The real prototype now, built in aluminum, the 4 frame geometry variations working exactly as the sketches had predicted. Carolyn had asked the specific, intelligent questions of someone who understood the field. Ethan had answered them with the directness of someone who had done the work and knew what the work was. Victoria had watched this and not said much, and had felt something she couldn't name precisely. Something like pride and something like recognition and something that was its own thing, particular to watching a person who had been containing themselves step into the full space of what they were capable of. After, walking to the parking lot, Ethan had said, "You didn't say anything in there." "You didn't need me to." He'd been quiet for a moment. "Carolyn wants to bring the coalition in. They have contacts with 3 medical equipment manufacturers." "I know. I was in the room. I mean, this is a different scale than the garage." She'd looked at him. "Is that a problem?" He'd considered it honestly, the way he considered things. "I don't know yet. I have to think about what it means for the day-to-day, for Maya's schedule, for what the garage is. It doesn't have to become something else." "It might, though." He'd looked at the sky and the way he looked at things when he was working something out. "I'm not sure that's bad. I'm just not sure yet." "That's honest," she'd said. "Maya thinks I should do it." Maya's 8. Maya's extremely intelligent and has 0 patience for my hesitation. Victoria had almost smiled. She gets it from somewhere. He'd looked at her sideways. "I'm not hesitant."
You're cautious. There's a difference. You sound like me. I've been listening to you for 3 months. He'd shaken his head slightly, and they'd parted in the parking lot, and she'd driven home with the particular feeling of something that was in motion and could not be stopped without a different kind of cost than the cost of letting it move.
The last Saturday was January 11th. She arrived at 10, with coffee, the way she always arrived. The garage door was open. Ethan was at the workbench. The speaker was playing the same Al Green record from the first visit. She wasn't sure if this was deliberate or if it was just what came on, and she didn't ask because either way it was the right thing. Maya was on the three-legged stool in the corner. This too, like the early visits. She had a library book open on her knees, but she put it down when Victoria came in, with the instinct of someone who had decided this visit was more important than the book. 4 days, Maya said. 4 days, Victoria confirmed. Do you know where you're staying? An apartment near the residency campus. Small, good light. Maya processed this. Do they have good art supply stores? I've already looked into it. Did you find one? 3 within reasonable distance. Maya appeared to find this satisfactory. She picked up her book again, which meant she was content and present. The particular reading as listening posture Victoria had come to recognize over the past months. Ethan turned from the workbench. He was working on something, not a wheelchair this time, she noticed, but the prototype, the full aluminum version, laid out with additional components she hadn't seen at the Carolyn meeting. He'd been iterating. New pieces, she said. 7th version of the lateral bracket. The 5th version was too rigid under lateral load. The 6th overcorrected. He held up the new bracket. Smaller than she expected. Cleaner. This one's right. She looked at it. He was correct. She could tell even without the engineering background, the same way she could tell when a painting had found its balance. Carolyn called yesterday, he said, setting the bracket down. I know. She emailed me too. He looked at her. She copied you? She wanted my read on the manufacturing timeline. I may have suggested some connections. She kept her voice even. You're not annoyed. I'm not annoyed. He turned back to the workbench. One of those connections is Marcus Hale. Marcus knows 3 people on the West Coast Medical Equipment Board. I know who Marcus Hale is. Then you know it's worth a conversation. Ethan was quiet for a moment, working with the bracket, making a small adjustment with a tool she couldn't name. You did this from the East Coast, he said, while you were packing. I did it from my laptop in 20 minutes. Don't make it larger than it is. I'm not. He set the tool down and turned to face her properly. I'm saying you didn't have to. I know I didn't have to. He looked at her for a moment. In the corner, Maya was reading, or performing reading while listening, which was her particular skill. Thank you, he said. She held up her coffee cup. You're welcome. He almost did the lopsided smile. Almost. The coffee's good today. It's always good. Your standards have just adjusted. My standards were fine. Your standards involved 4-hour-old hot plate coffee. That coffee was functional. A lot of things are functional without being good. He picked up his own cup and drank and said nothing to that, which meant she'd gotten him, and he knew it. She'd brought something. It was in the car. She'd left it there, unsure until she arrived whether she was actually going to bring it in. She went back out to the car and opened the rear door and lifted it out carefully. It was wrapped in brown paper, which she'd done herself, not particularly well, the tape at inconsistent angles. She brought it back into the garage. Both Ethan and Maya were watching when she came back in. What is that? Maya said. Not a question. A child's version of immediate recognition that something significant was happening. Victoria held the wrapped rectangle against her forearm and looked at Ethan. I painted something, she said. Specifically. He waited. I started it 3 weeks ago. I finished it Monday. She held it out. He took it. He looked at the brown paper for a second, then unwrapped it with the care he brought to things that mattered. The paper came away in sections. He turned the canvas around and looked at it. Maya had climbed off the stool and was beside him in 4 steps. The painting was the garage. Not a literal rendering. She wasn't a realist painter, hadn't been one since her early 20s, and the work she'd made in the past months didn't operate that way. But it was recognizably the garage. The way a place was recognizable when someone had paid real attention to its quality rather than its appearance.
The light coming in through the open rolling door, the low amber of a late afternoon. The shelves along the back wall, suggested rather than detailed. The corkboard, dark rectangle, warmer than the wall, the photographs present as texture and implication rather than image. The workbench, the specific weight of a space where work happened. And in the foreground, the light on the concrete floor and the way it fell on an ordinary day, doing nothing in particular and being, for that reason, everything.
She had painted it the way she painted everything now, from honesty rather than caution. She had not made it beautiful. She had made it true. Ethan looked at it for a long time. Maya said very quietly for Maya, "That's our garage." "Yes," Victoria said. "It looks like how it feels," Maya said, "not how it looks." Victoria looked at the child. 8 years old, and she had said the thing that Victoria had been working toward as a description of her own practice for 20 years. "That's exactly what I was trying to do." Maya looked at her with the serious equanimity of someone receiving this as fair confirmation of her assessment, and then she turned and went back to the stool and picked up her book, because she was 8, and the emotional register of the moment was as much as she wanted to hold right now. Ethan had not said anything. He was still looking at the painting with the focus he gave to things he was actually assessing, not performing appreciation, actually moving through the work. She watched him see it. "The corkboard," he said finally. "I spent 2 days on the corkboard." "It's right." He looked up. "The light is exactly right. I've looked at that floor every day for 4 years, and I've never seen it like that, but that's exactly what it is." "That's the thing about painting," she said. "You can't see what you look at until you have to look for a reason." He nodded slowly. He carried it to the workbench and leaned it against the shelving, far side from the mounted corkboard, so it was visible from most of the garage. He stepped back and looked at it in its new position. "Stays here?" he said. "It's yours." He looked at her. Something in his face that was difficult to read. Not the managed neutrality she'd seen in the early weeks, but something more open than that, and more careful for being open. "Victoria," he said, "don't make a speech. You don't make speeches." "I wasn't going to make a speech." "Good. I was going to say—" He stopped. Reconsidered. "I was going to say that the last 4 months changed something for me, and I'm not going to attribute it to one thing because that's not how it works. But you're a significant part of it." She looked at the painting on the workbench wall, at the garage around it, the real garage, ordinary and functional and full of the evidence of careful work. At the 7th version bracket on the workbench, solved now, correct. At Maya on the stool with her book. "You changed something for me too," she said. "You know that." "Yeah." "The first day. You asked if I was okay and you meant it as a real question." "I remember." "I didn't answer."
"I remember that too." She looked at him. "I'm okay," she said. "I want you to have the actual answer. I'm not all the way there, and some mornings are still bad, and I don't know what the residency is going to be, but I'm okay in the way that matters. I'm doing things that are mine again." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "I can see that." He said it simply, in the way he said things that were observations, like it was a fact visible from the outside, not a reassurance. She believed him because he didn't reassure. He observed, and when he told you something, it was because he'd looked carefully first. She left on the 15th. The drive to the airport was early morning, before the city was fully awake. Crestwood in the particular pre-dawn state of a place that had not yet started performing itself for the day. She drove the modified car, the one she'd been driving for 11 months, the hand controls she knew now, with the unconscious fluency of anything practiced past the point of thinking. She was not sad about leaving. She had thought she might be, in the weeks leading up to it, imagining the departure as a loss of something. It didn't feel like a loss, it felt like a continuation. Her phone had 3 texts from that morning. Diane. "Call me when you land. I'm going to be anxious until you do, and I'd rather not be anxious all day." Garrett, her operations director, a brief professional note confirming a contract detail that he was handling and had wanted to flag, which was exactly the kind of message that meant the handoff had worked. And Ethan at 6:12 a.m., which meant he'd been up since at least 6 or had set an alarm specifically. Good luck. Paint something you can't predict. She read that one twice at a red light. Paint something you can't predict. It was the right thing. It was the thing she was going to the residency to do.
not to refine what she already knew she could make, but to go further into the territory she'd only glimpsed from the lower left quadrant of a painting she'd made in a second bedroom on Orchard Street in the first raw weeks of getting back to work. She texted back one word: always. The residency was 6 months of the hardest and most necessary work she'd done since the early days of Sterling Tech. The campus was a converted estate on the outskirts of a mid-sized city in New England. Old stone buildings, large studio spaces with northern light, 23 artists across disciplines sharing resources and schedules, and the specific social ecosystem of people who were serious about their work and not always easy to be around. Victoria had not expected it to be easy, and it wasn't. The studio space she was assigned had a long window that looked out onto a courtyard that was, in January, bare and cold and gray. She had spent the first week arranging and rearranging the space, finding the workflow, calibrating to northern light, which was different from Pacific Northwest light in ways she hadn't anticipated. She had started 3 canvases in the first 2 weeks and abandoned all 3, and felt each time that she had wasted time. And then she had talked to a sculptor named Bridget who had been doing residencies for 20 years and who said, with the flat directness of someone who had no interest in softening experience, "The first month is always garbage. You're meeting your own habits." Victoria had gone back to the studio after that conversation and looked at the 3 abandoned canvases and thought, she's right. She was meeting her habits, the defensive ones, the ones she'd been slowly dismantling since September, but that reasserted themselves in new contexts. She started a 4th canvas. She didn't abandon it. She talked to Ethan twice a week, usually in the evenings when he'd put Maya to bed and had the garage or the house quiet around him. The calls were not long. Neither of them operated on long calls. But they were regular in the way that regularity mattered, the way knowing something would happen made it a different kind of thing. He told her about the prototype and the coalition meetings and the first real conversation with a manufacturing contact that had gone better than expected and then complicated in ways he hadn't anticipated and that he was working through. He told her about Maya's swimming, which had moved from toleration to genuine competitive intensity over the winter. He told her about a sketch he'd made that he didn't know what to do with, a product concept beyond wheelchairs, something in the broader landscape of adaptive design. Something that had surprised him when it came out of the pencil. "Send it to me," she said. "It's a rough sketch." "I know what rough sketches look like." He sent it. She looked at it on her phone in the studio with the northern light coming in gray over the bare courtyard, and she looked at it for a long time with the specific attention she'd learned from him. The honest assessment, not the kind assessment. "The proportions are off in the lower right," she texted back. "I know. Everything else is correct." A pause, then, "That's what I thought. Make the adjustment and send the revised version to Carolyn." "I was thinking about it." "Stop thinking about it." Another pause, then, "How's the painting?" She looked at the 4th canvas, the one she hadn't abandoned, the one that was 3 weeks in now and beginning to tell her what it wanted to be. "Getting honest," she said. "Good honest or bad honest?" "Is there bad honest?" "There's honest that's just pain, and then there's honest that's pain plus something else." She looked at the canvas, the paint surface, the layers, the decision she'd made yesterday that had unlocked something she hadn't been able to reach for months. "The second kind," she said. "Mostly." "Good," he said. And she could hear the real thing in his voice. Not the polite satisfaction of someone saying the right thing, but the actual relief of someone who cared whether she was okay and had been waiting without making an issue of it to hear that she was. She finished the residency in July. Not officially. The program ran through mid-July, and she was there for all of it. But she finished in the sense that mattered in the final week of June, when she completed the last large-scale canvas in the series she'd been building since February, a series of 7 paintings that constituted the most honest work she'd ever made. She knew this not because she felt good about them, though she did, but because she could see them clearly. Their actual strengths and their actual limitations, in a way she'd never been able to see her own work before, and that clarity felt like a different order of capability than what she'd had before the accident. The accident. She still thought of it as a dividing line, before and after, but the quality of how she thought about it had changed. It wasn't a wall anymore. It was more like a place in a road where the road turned and you couldn't see what had been on the straight path that continued on the other side of the turn. She'd been grief-stricken about that straight path for a long time. She still was, sometimes, on the bad mornings Patricia had helped her understand she'd always have occasionally. The grief wasn't wrong, but it sat differently now alongside what was on the road she was actually on. She had learned something about fear in the residency. Not that it went away. It didn't. And she was suspicious of narratives in which it did because that was the fairy tale version. And she'd stopped needing the fairy tale version sometime around October when a man in a garage had asked her a real question and waited for a real answer. What she'd learned was that fear was information and not instruction, that it told you where something mattered without telling you whether to proceed, that proceeding despite it was not the same as recklessness. That being afraid of something and doing it anyway was not a heroic quality. It was a practical one, the ordinary work of a person who had decided that what they were afraid of was less important than what they would lose by not going. She thought about this in the final weeks of the residency and thought about who had taught her, by example rather than instruction, that this was true. She thought about a man who had sent a design concept to a journal before he could talk himself out of it, who had called Carolyn Marsh one afternoon while his daughter was at swimming, who had pulled out old sketches and put them back and then pulled them out again until finally the question stopped being whether and started being when. She called him on a Wednesday evening in late June after the last large canvas was finished. He picked up on the second ring. "Done," she said. "The series?" "The series." She heard him exhale, a quiet sound, the kind that meant relief rather than surprise. "Tell me," he said. 7 paintings. The largest is 4 feet by 5. The smallest is 18 by 24. She paused. "They're good." He knew what it cost her to say that without qualification. "Yeah," he said. "I know." "How do you know?" "Because you'd have said I think they're good if you weren't sure." She was quiet for a moment. This was the thing about him. The careful attention, the way it had accumulated over months into a kind of knowing that was different from what she shared with Diane or Patricia or anyone else. Not more or less. Different. The specific knowledge that came from watching someone work, from being honest with them in the way that honesty was possible when there was nothing to perform. "How's the coalition meeting?" she said. "Next week. The manufacturing contact is flying in. In person. In person." A beat. "Maya made me get a new jacket." "For the meeting?" She said the one I wore to the gallery was fine, but this is business and they're different. She's not wrong. She's 8. She was 8 in September. She turned 9 in January. A pause. "You remembered." "I sent her a card." She put it on the wall in her room. He said it simply. She talked about it for 2 days. Victoria looked at the finished canvas against the studio wall, at the northern light in the courtyard, which in late June had turned into something else entirely, green now, alive, the courtyard full of what it had been holding through the bare winter. She looked at the light and thought about the light in a garage on Clement Street and how, months ago, she'd noticed it was the same quality, that low amber, the kind that made everything look like it was being seen for the first time. "I've been thinking about what comes next," she said. "For the company? For the painting. Garrett's been managing Sterling Tech well. Better than well. Honestly, he's made decisions I wouldn't have thought to make, and 2 of them were exactly right. I'm going back to the CEO role in July, but I think the structure has changed permanently. I can do both." "You always could do both." "I didn't know that before." "I know," he said. "I'm saying you can." She heard the distinction, not a correction, an observation, present tense, about what was true now. She had told him once that she was sick of the performance of being watched to see if she was okay. He had never watched her that way. He had watched her the way you watched someone who was already capable and were simply curious about what they would do with it. "There's a gallery in Portland," she said. "Independent. Good reputation. They reached out after the Crestwood show. One of the judges apparently talked to them. They want to see the residency work." "When?" "August." "That's fast." "I know." She paused. "I want you to come. When I show the work, I want you to see it in person." He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of hesitation, the quiet of someone sitting with a thing they already knew the answer to and were taking a moment to acknowledge it properly. "August," he said, "you can bring Maya. She'll tell the gallery staff everything she knows about the work. I'll brief her beforehand so she gets the details right. a sound that was almost a laugh. Yeah, okay, August. She came back to Crestwood on July 18th, on a Thursday afternoon, driving from the airport the way she'd driven there in January. The city doing its business, the streets ordinary, the Aldridge building visible from the highway approach. She did not go to the office that afternoon. She went home, and she unpacked, and she called Diane, who answered on the first ring, and talked for 45 minutes about nothing in particular and everything in general, which was the specific function of a friendship that had lasted 15 years and showed no sign of stopping. She went to the office on Friday morning. The 14th floor looked the same. The accessible corridors, the lowered reception desk, the wide windows. Garrett met her at the elevator and walked with her to the office and gave her a clear, unhurried overview of everything that had happened in the 6 months. It took about an hour. He was thorough and direct, and she asked 5 questions and received 5 answers that demonstrated actual command of the situation. When he left, she sat at her desk and looked at the downtown Crestwood skyline. The Aldridge building reflected in the glass of the next building, herself from the outside. She wasn't sure what she felt. Something that was complete and not finished, which was different from the feeling she'd had in January, which had been incomplete and also not finished. The wholeness of something that had more room in it now. That could hold more. She picked up her phone and texted Ethan, back. His response, 3 minutes later, was, "Welcome back. Coffee Saturday?" She typed back, "I'll bring it." Then she put the phone down and opened her laptop and began to read the 6 months of work that her company had made without her. Saturday, she drove to Clement Street. The garage was how it always was. Rolling door open, the particular morning light, the sound of work happening. She could hear the low-volume speaker before she got out of the car. Different record today. She didn't recognize it, but it was the right mood. She got the coffee from the passenger seat and went in. Ethan was at the workbench. The painting was on the wall above it. Her painting, the garage, leaned against the shelving where he'd put it in January. It was still there. She hadn't known, when she painted it, whether it would stay. She saw now that it had stayed the way things stayed when they had found their right place. He turned when he heard her. She held up the coffee. "You're early," he said. "I didn't sleep well. Jet lag doesn't actually work east to west, but apparently my body doesn't know that. Maya's at swimming. She'll be back by 11. She'll want to hear everything about the residency." "I know." Victoria set the coffee on the workbench and looked at the painting, then at the prototype beside it. Full aluminum, clean geometry. The 7th version bracket she'd last seen in January, now part of a completed assembly that hadn't existed then. "You finished it." "Version 9, 7 wasn't right either." 9. The load distribution on 7 was still wrong. 8 overcorrected again. He held up the finished bracket. 9 is right. Carolyn agrees. The manufacturing contact agrees. She looked at the complete assembly, the whole system, everything he'd been building from the first cardboard mock-ups, present now in real material. "It's good," she said. "It works," he said. And then, after a moment, the thing she recognized in his voice now. "It's good." She looked at him. He was looking at the assembly the way she looked at finished paintings. The honest look, seeing it for what it actually was, without the inflation of hope or the deflation of self-doubt. The clean look. "How does it feel?" she said. "Like a long time," he said, "and also like it happened fast. Both things. Both things." He set the assembly down carefully. "The manufacturing conversation is real. They want a production run by spring." "That's significant." "I know." He said it with the same measured care he'd brought to every significant thing, not minimizing, not inflating, just accurate. Carolyn thinks there are 3 other product directions that could follow from this, longer term. There are. I've thought about 2 of them. He looked at her. "Of course you have. You've thought about them too. You just haven't said them out loud yet." He almost did the smile. "The workshop on Kendall Street has offered me a permanent studio space, half-price residency for local designers." This was new. She waited. "I'm thinking about what it would mean for the garage," he said. "Whether both things can exist. The repair work and the design work." "The repair work is design work." "You know what I mean." "I do." She looked at the corkboard. The photographs, the modifications, the custom frames,
Dominic's chair with the aggressive black paint, a few new ones she didn't recognize. New clients, new work. The garage is where you started, she said. That doesn't have to go away for the other things to be real. He was quiet for a moment, thinking about it in the honest way. Maya wants me to take the studio space. Then take the studio space. She's 9. She's extremely intelligent and has zero patience for your hesitation. He looked at her. That's what I said about her. I know, I was listening. He turned back to the workbench and picked up his coffee and drank. Outside on Clement Street, the Saturday morning was in full activity. The laundromat, the taqueria prepping for the lunch rush, the particular domestic noise of a neighborhood that had been there a long time and expected to remain. Victoria looked at the painting on the wall, the garage, the light on the concrete floor, the corkboard with its photographs. She had painted it from memory and attention, from the specific quality of having been in this place enough times that it had entered her in the way places entered you. Not as a backdrop, but as a thing with its own particular weight and meaning. She thought about what it meant that she had painted it, not as a technical observation, but as a human one. Before the accident, she had painted abstract work, compositions built from formal relationships, from the internal logic of color and mark and structure. She had never painted places or people. She had considered that kind of work to be easier, more sentimental, not the territory she was interested in. She had painted this garage and it was the best thing she'd made in 20 years, and it was hanging above a workbench on Clement Street in a part of Crestwood that the real estate listings called up and coming. And that was in fact just a block where people worked and lived and tried to do things that mattered. She had been wrong about sentiment. Sentiment was not the soft version of feeling. It was the specific version, the kind that had an actual object and refused to be generalized. She had painted a specific place because a specific place had changed something in her, and the change was not generic. It was hers. It was the lower left quadrant where she'd stopped being careful, and then everything that had followed from there. I've been thinking about something, she said. Ethan waited. The gallery in Portland, the August show. If it goes well, there may be others. I've had interest from 2 other galleries since the Crestwood show. She looked at the painting. I'm not leaving Sterling Tech, and I'm not treating the painting as a side project. They're both real. I'm not choosing. Okay, he said. Not that sounds hard, or how will you manage that? Just okay, because he understood that this was a statement rather than a question. I wanted to say it out loud to someone who would take it seriously, she said. I take it seriously. I know. She looked at him. You've always taken it seriously, even before I did. He was quiet. She thought he might say something about the early days, but the first visit, the wobble in the rear right wheel, the conversation about what they'd each given up. She would have understood if he had. She was half expecting it. Instead, he said, "The coffee's good today." She looked at him, and then she laughed. A real one, not the social kind, the kind that came from a specific place and couldn't be manufactured. It surprised her the way real laughter sometimes did. It surprised him too, she could tell, and he smiled. The lopsided one, brief, completely genuine. It's always good, she said. I know, he said. I'm just saying. Outside, the morning light on Clement Street was doing what morning light did in this part of Crestwood in July. Warm and direct, none of the low amber drama of autumn, just clean and straightforward and bright. The kind of light you could see clearly in, which was the best kind. Maya would be back from swimming in an hour. She would want to hear everything. She would have opinions about the Portland Gallery and the studio space and the manufacturing timeline, and probably about the coffee, which she was theoretically too young for and which she had been incrementally negotiating access to since March. Ethan would hold the line on the coffee and not on most of the other things, which was the right allocation of firmness. Victoria would sit in the garage with the painting on the wall above the workbench and drink her coffee and talk to a man who fixed broken things and a 9-year-old who had inherited her father's ability to see what was actually there. And she would not describe this as happiness exactly, because happiness was a word that asked too much of any given moment, and she had learned to ask less and receive more. She would describe it as this. She was here. She was working. She was doing things that were hers. She was not okay in the smooth, frictionless sense that people meant when they said okay. She was okay in the actual sense, the one that included bad mornings and abandoned canvases and wrong version brackets and the specific grief of a before and after that never fully resolved. That okay? The real one. Ethan turned back to the workbench and picked up a tool and went back to work.
Not because the conversation was over, but because this was what they did. They talked and they worked, and the two things happened in the same space without one requiring the other to pause. She had always liked that about this place. She liked that it had never required her to perform a particular version of herself. She thought briefly about the first day, the hand-painted sign, the slight grade on the concrete approach, the Al Green record, and a man who had looked at her not as a category, but as a person who had brought in a wheel that wasn't tracking right. She thought about how she had come in for a bearing repair and had ended up here, in July, in a different version of her own life. People said things like that and meant it as a miracle. She didn't mean it as a miracle. She meant it as the plain consequence of a sequence of choices. The choice to bring the chair in, to stay while he worked, to answer the question he'd asked honestly, to open the closet, to clean the brushes, to argue the marks onto the canvas, to submit the work before she could stop herself. One thing, and then the next thing, none of them individually miraculous, all of them together amounting to something that had changed the quality of her life in ways she had not predicted and could not have engineered. That was the thing about it. You couldn't engineer it. You could only stay present enough to notice when a door was open and walk through it anyway, even when what was on the other side was uncertain, even when you were afraid, even when your hands were tired and the canvas was wrong and the cadmium was too loud. You showed up, you did the work, you let yourself be known by the people who asked real questions and waited for real answers. The rest of it, the actual content of a life, that came from what you built with those people, in those spaces, on those ordinary Saturdays that didn't announce themselves as important and turned out to be everything. Ethan worked. The record played. The light came in through the open door the way it always had. Above the workbench, the painting hung where she had put it, and it was exactly where it belonged,